Hi all, this is Sabri and it's pleasure to meet you all again. In this video, we are just quickly going to discuss about what Spring Framework is all about. Especially we are going to discuss about the term called framework. Why do we call it as a framework? Now before I take you to that understanding, just look at the definition that's been displayed in front of you. Here we are just talking about the creation of a Java enterprise application. Yes, of course, Spring Framework is going to be majorly used for creating a Java enterprise application. We have different types of applications. One is standalone application. We have web applications. We have enterprise application. The main motive for bringing up the Spring Framework by the inventor is to focus on developing an enterprise graded application. You can develop Spring applications by using Java. Mainly we'll be using Java, and most of the developers out there are using Java in order to develop Spring application. But then we can also use Groovy and Kotlin. There are two other aspects of languages which we can use in Spring Framework. One is Groovy and Kotlin. They both are JVM standards of languages. So you can quickly learn even Groovy and Kotlin. One example for Kotlin is Android applications are nowadays developed using Kotlin language. So if you are a Java guy, then sure you can learn Kotlin quite easily. Okay, now let's move on to learn this term called framework. So how are we going to understand this term called framework? Now, usually if you look at the standards in Java applications, we usually package all our code, the bytecode files and the other supplementary files inside a specific archive called the jar, which is called as a Java archive file. I guess most of you might be heard about it, and you should if you are coming from the Java background. If not, please just quickly go and have a learning on what jar means. So one of the fundamental archive file that we have in the Java application is all about the jar, and here it could be an executable file or it could be a library based file. But here right now I just have a single jar file where it is an isolated jar file, and this jar file is going to be a single representation, so that I'm going to give a name called Java library for it. So I'm talking about a term called library here because I own a single jar file here, just a single jar file. And whenever you have a single jar file, then you represent them as a library where you can make use of that jar in any of your application development. Reusability comes into the picture when we talk about the libraries, right? We do have it in C and C++ languages. We talk about libraries. Libraries are specifically for reusability. In any application development, you can make use of that library. The same way, this is not an executable jar I'm talking about. This is just a jar which is going to be for reusable fashion, so that it's a single jar. I'm representing that single jar as a Java library. Usually a single jar means it's library by itself. So now we can say an example for that as a collections API. In core Java, we have one of the concept called collections API. You might have learned about it. So collections API is one of the a best example for calling that as a library, because it's a single jar. Probably you might have a single jar over there for collections like java.util. Now it might be termed as a package, but then we consider them as a jar. If it's a jar, then it's going to be a library. But how about framework? So how do we differentiate framework here? Frameworks are nothing but collection of libraries. Okay, so you can have multiple jars out there and you group them, right? You group them and then you give a term called collection of jars for it. So when it is a collection of jars, means each jar represents a library there. So this collection of jar is going to be called as a Java framework. So Spring is a framework, is not a library. That's the conclusion that we are coming up here. Please underline the statement that Spring is not a library by itself. It's a framework, but internally to the framework, what it has is a collection of library, right? So when you have a collection of jars and you group them, and then you can represent them as a Java framework, and you can extend this Java framework whenever needed to develop any kind of application. It depends on the application's requirement and the use cases. So one good example for that is Struts. Struts is a Java framework. it was basically used for creating a web application. We use struts exclusively for developing a web application. Majorly, we use struts in the earlier days, but then now we are upgrading ourselves to Spring, because Spring has an end-to-end solution for developing all kinds of applications. And Hibernate is also a Java framework, and it's an ORM framework, which is used for enabling an object relational mapping with the database. We might not talk about much of Hibernate here. I might come up with a separate playlist for Hibernate. Now, Spring is absolutely a Java framework. So some examples for Java frameworks are Struts, Hibernate, and Spring is all one example that we can give for Java framework as. So there's a big difference between Java library and Java framework. The main difference that you are seeing out here is Java library is nothing but a single isolated jar, wherein Java framework is nothing but collection of jars, and you call them as a framework over there. But keep in mind that Spring framework is indeed internally having multiple libraries in it, right? So one good example is Spring Core is a library, Spring MVC is a library, Spring JPA is a library, right? If you collect all these libraries together, then we give a name called Spring Framework. So that's it in this video. In the next video, we are going to discuss about what is the main purpose of using a Spring Framework. Until then, have a great day. Thank you.